Okay, hello, and thank you. I want to say thank you to Fatia and to the National Symposium on Morality Studies in Social Psychology hosted by Istanbul University for inviting me to give an interview. My name is Paul Conway. I'm an associate professor of social psychology at the University of Southampton, and I study moral psychology with a focus on moral dilemmas and how people make moral decisions. But I'm interested in moral psychology broadly, and in fact all social psychology. And so I've got some questions that I can answer for you here today, and I'm happy to do that. So, starting at the beginning, the first question is, in the field of moral research, what are some of the most amusing, peculiar, or absurd questions and critiques you have encountered? I really love this question because the answer is so many. There are so many. Let's see, at the beginning, the first question that was important in my career was the question of whether psychopaths are more utilitarian than other people. There was a paper, Bartels and Pizarro 2010, that called The Mismeasure of Morals, where they showed that people who score high in psychopathy tend to accept sacrificial harm. So if you say, would you kill a baby to save a village? They say, oh yes, I absolutely would. Where is this baby? They say, I'll do it right now. And some people took that to mean that those high in psychopathy, that is to say, they have a callous disregard for the well-being of others, they must be more moral than the rest of us. And I saw a conference talk where people were saying, we should all try harder to be more like psychopaths. They're the truly good ones, you see. They're the ones trying to save the group, not like the rest of us. So I was not persuaded by this argument, and I applied this technique called process dissociation, and there's additional modeling techniques like the CNI model that are doing this kind of work. And what that lets you do is you can tease apart how much do people want to not hurt individual targets and how much do they want to save the group as two separate things. And what these data showed very clearly was people high in psychopathy are not more utilitarian or more focused on saving the group. They're very unconcerned about causing harm. They do not feel the emotional response to hurting that other people feel when they contemplate hurting someone, and so they don't see what the problem is. What's the big deal? Just kill one person, and then you've saved 5. That makes you a hero. But unfortunately, our data also show that people high in psychopathy are not more interested in saving the group. If anything, they're less interested in saving the group. So they aren't concerned about maximizing outcomes. They aren't concerned with causing harm. They don't really care about this dilemma, but they might see it as an exciting opportunity to get to murder and have an excuse for it. And they might think to themselves, I've always wanted a chance to try it out and get away with it. Well, this is their chance. So are psychopaths more utilitarian? No, but some people think that they are and think that we should be more psychopathic as a result. Another silly dilemma paper, there's a paper called Granny Dumping, showing that people don't mind sacrificing old people to save young people. And the fact that they called it Granny Dumping is one of the funniest titles to me in science. There's another paper called, Is It Better to Throw a Bomb on a Person or a Person on a Bomb? And they show that if you have a bomb in your hand and one room there's 5 people you could throw it into, and one room there's 1 person you could throw it into, throwing the bomb onto a person so it blows up and kills them and saves 5, most people think is okay. But if you have a person and there's a bomb in the room and you could throw the person onto the bomb so it blows them up and it saves 5 lives, people don't think that's okay because you're directly causing murder. That's another great title, in my opinion, for a paper. Another great title is the paper called The Drunk Utilitarian, that argued as people drink more and more alcohol, they get more and more willing to sacrifice lives or cause murder on behalf of more optimal outcomes. Although recent work has suggested that finding is, in fact, not replicable. There's, of course, a whole book called Would You Push the Fat Man?, where there was these versions of trolley dilemmas, the footbridge dilemma, where instead of the classic case, the classic trolley where there's a runaway trolley, it's going to run over 5 people, and if you press a button, it will instead run over 1 person. That's the classic trolley case. Instead, Some people looked at what they called the footbridge case with a fat man. So now you're standing on a bridge over the train tracks. The runaway trolley is about to run over 5 people, but you could push a very fat man off the bridge onto the tracks, and somehow he's so large that the fat of his body will stop a 60-ton moving vehicle and therefore save 5 people's lives. Now, Anita Kerner has shown that people don't seem to believe this is likely to happen, and they're unwilling to push, in part because they think it's unrealistic or unlikely to work. So they would just become a murderer, and then 6 people would be dead instead of 5 people would be dead. But that's not how philosophers have interpreted this. They said, aha, it's because people are so emotional at pushing someone off of a bridge. That's why they don't want to do it. And then people worried that people were finding this funny. So Chris Bauman has a nice paper from 2014 showing that people think, if you say, do you want to push a fat man off a bridge to stop a train? People think, wow, that's really funny, and they're not really in the right headspace to answer a serious moral dilemma. So some people have followed up by changing it to a normal-sized person wearing a very large and heavy backpack that you don't have time to take off is standing in front of you. So you could push this normal-sized person with the backpack off of the bridge to stop the train. It changes responses a little bit, but of course it doesn't solve the actual problem of no one believes that's going to work. There's another paper that I like that asked, well, are people always equally utilitarian? Are they more willing to murder some people to save other people if it works to their advantage? And for some reason, they created a study where they said, imagine you're on a spaceship traveling past Earth on a long-distance mission, and somehow there's only just a couple men, and you're one of them, and there's several women. So these other men are your romantic rivals, and you would like to get together with all the women on the spaceship. Would you therefore murder the other men in a trolley dilemma scenario so that you could become the last man on this spaceship? And apparently a lot of people said, yes, I absolutely would. That's perfectly fine. So yeah, apparently people are more utilitarian when they're on intergenerational spaceships and they're facing, the opportunity to get rid of romantic rivals. I saw another paper on moral decision making, and the title, and I quote, is Cat Ownership, Psychotic Experiences and Moral Decision Making in the United Arab Emirates. So that's an interesting combination of topics. I haven't delved further into that paper, but I should take a look. And then, of course, if we go beyond the domain of moral dilemmas themselves, there's all sorts of fascinating and unusual and wacky things that people have researched. Of course, Jonathan Haidt classically asked people all these questions. What if Mark and Lisa are brother and sister, and they decide to go to Paris together, and they get together? How bad is that? How immoral and disgusting? And he had many other strange and disgusting scenarios. What if you wipe your behind with the flag of your nation? Is that bad? And so many questions like this, trying to get at people's intuitions about what's right and what's disgusting. And there's also a paper I like very much by Andy Von Asch from 2017, where he asked people if they are willing to take a serious personal sacrifice in order to stop other people from learning potentially damaging moral reputation information. So he had some people believe they might look a bit racist doing this one task, and then he asked them whether they would rather put their hand in a bucket of disgusting worms to prevent him from sharing the results of their supposed racism with the rest of the university. And about 30% of people agreed to put their hand in a bucket of worms. And other people, almost 2/3 of people, were willing to take a physical shock. So a lot of people are willing to do surprisingly complicated and disturbing things to themselves to maintain their moral reputation in the eyes of others. So that's question 1. That's one of my favorite questions, so I went a bit long. Question number 2 is, how do you evaluate the future of moral psychology? And I would say the future is bright. It's very bright. There's so much work that can be done, and there's so much work that is being done, and it's just growing all the time. My understanding is that approximately 1/3 of all the content in social psychology journals and conferences these days could be classified as moral psychology. Not everyone uses the same terminology, but things like aggression and pro-social behavior, if you look at your classic social psychology textbooks, Those chapters are about morality. They just don't use the word morality. In fact, there's a lot of classic work on why do people help each other, and why do people fail to help each other. This is moral psychology. In the modern era, the term morality occurs on many, many abstracts, and other ones have words like justice or parity or fairness and so on. It seems like an increasing number of papers every single year. It's just, the line goes up and up and up for moral psychology. And what's more interesting from my perspective is that almost every single study that you ever see that compares moral processing or thinking or emotions or decisions or outcomes to anything that's non-moral, the moral decisions, the moral processes, the moral emotions, the moral outcomes are always stronger and more powerful than the non-moral ones. It always works that morality beats non-morality every single time. It's the first thing we care about in person perception. It's the most valuable information in person perception. There's the moral pop-out effect in basic cognitive processing. If you hear a bunch of words like happy, sad, untrustworthy, it's the untrustworthy that jumps out to you the most and elicits immediate attention gathering processing on a subtle level, on a level of reaction times and EEG waveforms, right? So morality is powerful, it's important, people care about it, it's part of the self-concept, it matters to everyday life, and of course, if you look at the world around us, morality is very important for the state of the world and how people treat each other. So there's so much work being done, and all I see is more and more and more work that needs to be done. We need new people to come in the field and show us more things that we haven't thought of so far, a point I'm going to come back to. So the future is bright, I would say. There's many fundamental questions that we can wrestle with that have more work to be done. Question number 3. Moral dilemmas are commonly employed in studies on moral decision-making, but there's a debate about how much these differ across cultural contexts. So what are my thoughts? Are cultural differences, do they exist? How can they be identified? And so on. So I do not agree that there are important cross-cultural differences, and I do not agree that there's much of a debate on this issue. In my view, I'm thinking of the paper by Awad and colleagues 2020 that had 70,000 participants from something like 100 countries. And what they showed is that, in fact, people's decisions on moral dilemmas, like sacrificial moral dilemmas, are very, very similar across the entire globe, with only some minor variations around the edges. That's what my view is. So I think cross-cultural variation in moral decision-making is quite modest, quite minimal. Although it does exist, you can measure it, and we have, in fact, found a little bit of evidence in some of our own studies. It's really not a major component. In my view, it's most people make similar patterns of decisions across different nations and cultural groups. Now, I welcome any data that's not consistent with this. I would be happy to see more of that. I will say that in those papers and also in my own work on this, and the other, there's a few papers looking at cross-cultural differences such as Gold and colleagues 2014, 2015, and so on. These differences show that there seems to be one cultural factor that does matter, which is to what degree do people in daily life depend closely on personal interactions with other people to make their life work? In other words, how closely socially tight are people? Are people making dinner together, staying together? Are people, living in family groups? Or do people live in sort of more independent, more isolated locations where maybe, a small family group might live together as opposed to a large family group? How often are you going to, social events with friends and neighbors and family? Some people live in a very social environment their whole lives, and other people are much more isolated. And the work shows that when people live in these more social contexts and they depend closely on one another, they are often less willing to accept sacrificial harm. So they would say, no, I wouldn't kill a baby even to save a village. And this finding makes sense to me, not so much as some sort of fundamental cultural difference, but rather as sort of a strategic sense that my work and other people's work have shown that people are aware. Someone saying they would kill a baby to save a village looks competent and smart and logical, but they also look cold and immoral and untrustworthy. And people are nervous about becoming friends with those people or relying on them too much, because if someone's willing to sacrifice another person for outcomes, perhaps they would be willing to sacrifice you. So this is a point made nicely. People like Jim Everett have made this point. Mitch Brown has made this point. A number of people. So there's this sort of there's a communication element to moral decision making. And so people who live in tight-knit social groups may be communicating, I'm a trustworthy person, I'm a moral person, you can rely on me, I will never make an ethically questionable choice, even if it would make technically logical sense or it would make the world outcomes better. I won't do it because I'm principled, and therefore you can rely on me. So people who live in communities where those are extra important may be more likely to make those types of decisions. But again, I don't see this as a fundamental moral difference, but rather as a strategic social decision-making question of how do you want other people to view you when you make moral decisions? Okay, that's where I'm at right now in terms of the field.